This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 273 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. We made it. It's week one of the regular season. We not only get to watch meaningful football, but we get to set our fantasy football lineups. The grind has begun. If you didn't see my tweet last week, which, by the way, you can follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB, but if you didn't see it last week on Twitter, I've got a new Late Round podcast schedule for the 2019 season. Instead of 3 shows per week, I'll be doing 4 of them. Each Tuesday, you'll hear me talk about 15 transactions that you can make to improve your fantasy roster. I do a column on NumberFire called 15 Transactions each week, so the podcast is closely tied to that article. But I also give an additional transaction on the show to give you a little bit more flavor. Wednesday's show is a new one. It's one that I'm calling 10 Trends, where I dig into 10 interesting team and player level trends that could end up having some sort of fantasy football impact. You'll hear the first one of those tomorrow. Thursday will be a start-sit show. I'll go over players and matchups that I like more and less than the consensus. And then, as usual, Friday will be the mailbag episode. Now, for those mailbag episodes during the regular season, I ask that you guys submit questions only through Twitter. Doing it by email would just cause a lot of chaos during the season. So if you could, just shoot those questions my way on Twitter each week. But those are the 4 shows. Like I said, today's a 15 transactions day, which coincides with my article over on NumberFire.com. Before getting to those transactions, though, I wanted to send another reminder about FanDuel's World Fantasy Football Championship. From September 5th through December 1st, you can enter a number of different qualifiers at different prize points over on FanDuel to earn a seat at the $2.5 million live final in Puerto Rico or the $3.5 million online championship. That's $6 million in prizes. For more info on the WFFC, visit FanDuel.com/WFFC or download the app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Buy Lamar Jackson. Now, if you've been listening to this podcast all offseason, this is the least surprising transaction that you're going to hear today. As you know, I think Lamar Jackson was the best value at quarterback during fantasy drafts this year. When he took over as Baltimore starter in Week 11, he failed to score fewer than 15.7 fantasy points in a single game while averaging 18.6 points per game. That was the 7th highest average from Week 11 onward at the quarterback position. And he did a lot of that with his legs. 11.4 points per game came from rushing. He had 17 rush attempts per game. Now, that number is going to likely dip here in 2019. But in 2018, he rushed for 557 yards in the games that he started. That put him on pace for 1,273 rushing yards across the entire season. Like I said, his rush attempts are going to decline, but he's still going to rush the ball a lot. He's still going to see a lot of rushing yards. And I think that we can all confidently say that if Lamar Jackson plays the entire season, he's probably going to hit 700 rushing yards. And you've heard this stat thrown out there over the last month on this show a lot. But if he hits that mark, he'll become the 9th quarterback to hit that mark since the year 2000. Of the 8 who have already done it, 7 of those quarterbacks during the season that they hit 700 rushing yards finished as top 5 options at quarterback in fantasy football that year. Now, the downside with Lamar Jackson is that he struggled as a passer last year. But Greg Roman is now the offensive coordinator for Baltimore. Greg Roman coached both Colin Kaepernick and Tyrod Taylor. They're both dual-threat quarterbacks. When he coached them, they had their best seasons efficiency-wise through the air. Under Greg Roman, Kaepernick's yards per attempt rate was 7.54. Without Roman, it was 6.71. Tyrod Taylor saw his yards per attempt basically drop by a full yard without Greg Roman. And the big thing with Lamar Jackson is that his early season schedule is awesome. They get Miami to kick off the season, and then they'll face Arizona and Kansas City. So all of that makes Lamar Jackson an incredibly intriguing passer this year in fantasy football. And like I said last week in the Bold Predictions episode, I think Lamar Jackson does have top 3 quarterback upside. Add or buy Justice Hill. I'm kind of surprised by Justice Hill's ownership on Yahoo and ESPN. But I love Justice Hill. I have Justice Hill on a ton of my fantasy teams this year. I already mentioned the start of Baltimore's season being a cakewalk. They have a really easy schedule. Their first 2 games are against 2 teams with some of the lowest over-unders that you'll find in the league over on FanDuel Sportsbook. That means that we're looking at positive game scripts for Baltimore during the first 2 weeks of the season. And if that's the case, they're going to run the ball a lot. Now, don't forget, when Lamar Jackson was under center in the regular season last year, Gus Edwards, an undrafted rookie, was 4th in the NFL in rush attempts. Now, a lot of that volume is going to go to Mark Ingram this year, but don't write off Justice Hill. He's super explosive. He ran a 4.4 40. He had an 82nd percentile speed score and a 95th percentile burst score. He could steal some looks in that backfield this year. And it wouldn't be the first time that Justice Hill stole looks from a bigger bodied player, from a guy who was more of the bruiser type. In college at Oklahoma State as a freshman, Justice Hill played ahead of Chris Carson. So I actually think that Justice Hill could see some work right away in this offense given that early season schedule. So you want him now, you don't want to wait. Sell Derrius Guice. I think Derrius Guice is really good. I've said on this podcast before, I think Derrius Guice is more of a 2020 guy and not a 2019 guy. And it has nothing to do with talent, it has everything to do with situation. Washington's odds of being a top half offense this year is pretty slim. And that impacts Derrius Guice. I think I mentioned this last week on the show, but since 2011, of the 90th percentile running back seasons that we've seen in fantasy football, only 5% of those seasons have come from offenses that rank 25th or worse in Number Fire's schedule-adjusted expected points model. To put that mouthful another way, good running backs come from good offenses in fantasy football. And then there's the schedule for Guice. This is part of the reason why I'm turned off of Guice early in the season. Washington starts off their year against Philadelphia, and then they get Dallas, and then they get Chicago. Those are some of the better/best rush defenses in football. It's not going to be easy for Derrius Guice to see a lot of volume in those games, or at the very least, a lot of production. So I wouldn't be surprised that if when I record this in week 4, Derrius Guice is a buy. But right now, I'm selling Derrius Guice because of those first 3 matchups. Buy Tyler Lockett. Touchdown regression is going to hit Tyler Lockett this year. He's not going to continue to score a touchdown on every 7.1 targets. Players don't maintain that type of efficiency. But Tyler Lockett no longer has Doug Baldwin in his offense. And last year, in 3 games without Doug Baldwin, 23.2% of Seattle's pass attempts went Tyler Lockett's way. When Baldwin was in the lineup, that dropped to 15.4%. Now, as we know, this is a Brian Schottenheimer-led offense, and that means there's not going to be a lot of pass attempts. But what's a little bit intriguing about the early season for Seattle is that there's a lot of shootout potential. Now, week 1 against Cincinnati, that's probably going to be a big positive game script for Seattle. Chris Carson could eat in week 1. But after that week 1 game, they get Pittsburgh, New Orleans, Arizona, the Rams, and Cleveland. And then after a tough matchup against Baltimore in week 7, you're looking at 3 more good matchups against Atlanta, Tampa Bay, and San Francisco. So Tyler Lockett's going to see a higher target share this year, and then with potential shootouts, maybe Seattle does throw more than we originally thought, at least more than I originally thought. So I love Tyler Lockett this year. I think he's going to have a monster season. Add Dare Ogunbowale. Tampa Bay is entering the season with just Peyton Barber, Ronald Jones, and Dare Ogunbowale in their backfield. Process of elimination tells us that Ogunbowale is at least worth a bench stash. Peyton Barber only had 871 rushing yards last year on 234 rushes. He was basically a flex play in fantasy football, at best. And then as we know, Ronald Jones struggled as a rookie. He had 23 carries for just 44 yards. But the bigger point here is that neither of those players are good pass catchers. Peyton Barber only had 29 targets last year. Ronald Jones had just 9. Jones does kind of have the physical profile of a pass-catching running back, but that's always been one of his weaknesses. He had a horrible reception share during his final collegiate season, and everyone talks out of Tampa Bay that he's still struggling as a receiver. So that's where Dare comes in. Ogunbowale had an 85th percentile target share in college. He caught 60 passes over his final 2 seasons at Wisconsin. He's the primary pass-catching back on Tampa Bay's roster. And what happens if he gains some traction and he does well and he digs into their early down work? Given the competition, this is why Ogunbowale is a very, very interesting stash. So I would add him if he's on your waiver wire. Sell Zach Ertz. Now, I'll be honest with you guys. I've been telling you to not draft Zach Ertz all summer, but his ADP did drop a good bit in August, and he became a little bit easier to draft. But even still, there seems to be a lot of people who still put him in that George Kittle tier. And I think that George Kittle is basically in his own second tier. Kittle has that Travis Kelce upside. Zach Ertz has been a very volume-dependent tight end. He's a good tight end, but he absolutely needs that volume, at least more than someone like George Kittle does. And that's where I'm afraid about Zach Ertz in 2019. Last year, things were pretty good for Ertz. He didn't have a ton of competition. Alshon Jeffrey was banged up, and they didn't even have a lot of competition for Jeffrey. And then Golden Tate came in halfway through the season, and we saw Zach Ertz's target share drop by about 7 percentage points. Competition affected Zach Ertz's volume. So what's going to happen in 2019? Well, Deshaun Jackson's there now. Dallas Goedert's an extra year in the league, and they drafted Miles Sanders. And the Eagles could be more run heavy because they're better this year than they were last year, at least on paper. So if there's someone in your league who's willing to buy Zach Ertz right now, I would sell him. Hold or buy the Arizona Cardinals offense. People are freaking out about what they've seen from this Arizona Cardinals offense in the preseason, but I'm not one of those people. They're not showing us everything. They're not showing us basically anything. They're not really running a lot of 4 and 5 wide receiver sets when that's what we're going to see a lot during the regular season. And we know that this Cliff Kingsbury offense is going to be both pass heavy and fast paced. Because when he was coach at Texas Tech, his offense is never ranked outside the top 10 in pass to rush attempt ratio. And they ranked outside of the top 10 in plays run per game just once. So I'm not panicking about what I saw in the preseason. The reason that they're not just a buy, though, is because they do have Baltimore and Carolina with 2 of their first 3 games. Those are some tough matchups. Those are some front sevens that could give this weak Arizona offensive line some struggles. Even week 1 against Detroit, you can make the same argument. So you could buy them right now, and I wouldn't fault you for it, but I also think that you could buy them in week 4 when things open up a little bit. Add Albert Wilson. So again, I don't like investing in bad offenses, and Miami's going to have a bad offense this year. But with Albert Wilson, there's not much of an investment that you have to make. He's just going to sit on your bench and you can get him out of free agency. Albert Wilson is part of #team production. He was awesome in college. He has a great dominator rating. Now, we shouldn't just weigh that heavier than how we would weigh what he's done as a pro, but it at least tells us that there's some baseline for how good of a player he is. Now, last season was the first year that Albert Wilson didn't play for the Chiefs. And he only played in 7 games, so we have somewhat of a limited sample. But according to Pro Football Focus, he ranked first in the NFL in yards per route run. And now this year, there's less competition and arguably better quarterback play. Kenny Stills is no longer in Miami, and the Dolphins' wide receiver depth chart is probably the worst in the league. And when you consider the skill sets of the other pass catchers in that offense, Albert Wilson is probably going to play a lot in the slot. We know that that brings advantageous matchups. So, realistically, maybe there's not a huge difference between someone like Albert Wilson and Trey Quinn. But Albert Wilson just has more natural upside given the type of athlete that he is, given the type of player that he is. So I think that Albert Wilson is a great add off the waiver wire right now. Sell Devin Singletary. So as you guys know, LaShawn McCoy was cut by the Bills last weekend and he signed with the Chiefs. That caused a lot of chaos with the Chiefs backfield, but it opened things up a lot for Devin Singletary. Now, I don't think Devin Singletary is necessarily horrible. I do think he had a lot of red flags, though, coming out. Because he's undersized, he had a horrible 40-yard dash time, and he wasn't much of a pass catcher in college. He's a smaller dude, and that's fearful for someone who could be a workhorse. And there's not a ton of receiving upside in the Bills' offense. The Texans were the only team with fewer running back receptions last year, and when Josh Allen started last season, Buffalo running backs averaged 4 fewer receptions per game than when Josh Allen wasn't starting. So Devin Singletary isn't very athletic, at least measurables-wise. He's small, he's not much of a pass catcher, and the environment as a pass catcher isn't that great. And then on top of that, there's already speculation that the backfield's going to be a committee to start the season. So this is where I'm at with Devin Singletary. He's probably a better running back than what the analytics tell you. But at the same time, I think he's someone that you're going to want to buy halfway through the season, then ride out during the first half of the season. So if you have him, there might be someone in your league who's really optimistic about all this movement, who sees LaShawn McCoy no longer on the Bills, and they get excited about Devin Singletary. If you can get something like 5th round value for Devin Singletary, I would trade him away. Buy Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, and O.J. Howard. Look, guys, there's not that much outside of Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, and O.J. Howard in Tampa Bay. Honestly, those 3 players could see a 70% target share in that offense this year. It wouldn't even be that surprising. And I talked about this on my bold predictions episode, but we often see teammates in the top 12 at wide receiver in fantasy football each year. We've averaged 1.7 instances of that happening per season over the last 7 years. So Chris Godwin still has a ceiling even though Mike Evans is there. And then I think that there's a chance that O.J. Howard is just special. Since 2011, there have been 5 seasons where a tight end had 30 or more targets and a yards per target rate at or above 11 yards. O.J. Howard has played in the NFL for 2 years, and he owns 2 of those 5 seasons. If you're struggling because Jameis Winston is their quarterback, I can understand that maybe to a degree. But fantasy football is about volume. And not only are these pass catchers really talented, but they're going to see a lot of volume. You have to buy into that. Drop Kareem Hunt. Kareem Hunt is rostered in over half of Yahoo fantasy leagues. And I don't really understand it for a guy who's going to be out until week 10. And when he comes back, we're not even guaranteed that he's going to see a huge workload. Nick Chubb is ahead of him on the depth chart. Now, you can make the argument that Kareem Hunt's a better running back than Nick Chubb is, but it's not the easiest argument to make. If we were guaranteed that Kareem Hunt would be a lead back when he came back from his suspension, then sure, stash Kareem Hunt. Hold on to Kareem Hunt until week 10. But we're not guaranteed that. And holding on to a player, that comes at a cost. I just figured that he's going to be one of the first players that you drop anyway once waivers start after week 1. I just really don't understand why he has the ownership that he does. Sell Tariq Cohen. I think Tariq Cohen is talented, but that's about it for his 2019 outlook. As we know, last year only 5 running backs had a higher target share in their offense, and only Christian McCaffrey and James White finished with more receiving yards than Tariq Cohen at running back. But things are so different in Chicago this year. Allen Robinson's healthy, and he's not coming off an ACL tear. Anthony Miller's got a year under his belt. And then, of course, the Bears added 2 running backs in Mike Davis and David Montgomery. The competition for backfield touches is a lot fiercer with those 2 backs in the backfield. Jordan Howard's known as a weak receiver. David Montgomery had a top 10 final collegiate season reception share among running backs in this year's class. David Montgomery is a way better pass catcher than Jordan Howard is. And then, as I noted before, Rich Rebar of Sharp Football Analysis, he pointed out this summer that the last back to finish in the top 24 in fantasy points per game in back-to-back seasons while having more than 70% of his fantasy production come from receiving was Darren Sproles. That happened all the way back in 2011 and 2012. Tariq Cohen saw 74% of his fantasy points come as a receiver last year. And then to top all this off, Matt Nagy said earlier this month, quote, "We moved Cohen around a lot last year, and I do feel like there was a time, probably later in the season, where we probably gave him a little bit too much." The head coach is saying that they gave Tariq Cohen too much work last year. It's really, really hard to invest in this player given all the moves they made, the backfield competition, and how the coach is currently thinking. So now is the time to sell Tariq Cohen. Add Deebo Samuel. The 49ers currently have 7 wide receivers on their roster entering the season, and there's no clear-cut number 1 guy. Now, Dante Pettis' average draft position ended up dropping a bit, and I personally invested a decent bit in Dante Pettis as a result. But I do think that Deebo Samuel is a very interesting bench stash right now. He had average production at South Carolina, but he also had a hard time staying healthy. And he checks the box of being a college kick returner. We want players who did things in every facet of the game. It's no different than how I like to target running backs who were receivers in college, because it means that coaches wanted to get that player the ball. And Deebo Samuel is a well above average athlete as well. And then you factor in the 2nd round draft capital, and he's a well-rounded prospect analytically. George Kittle is the only player in that passing attack with a locked-in target share. So why not throw a dart at Deebo Samuel? Sell Aaron Rodgers. Now, I think Aaron Rodgers is going to be better this year than last year. There's a new regime, there's more experienced pass catchers, and there's positive touchdown regression that's going to hit. He had a 4.2% touchdown rate last year when his career average is 6.2%. But the reason that I'm selling Aaron Rodgers right now is because the first 2 weeks of the season, he gets Chicago and Minnesota. When you know the quarterback position is relatively replaceable, there's no reason to walk into those matchups. And then you can even argue that the schedule doesn't get that much better, because after those 2 games, they get Denver, Philadelphia, and Dallas. So yes, I do believe that Aaron Rodgers is a candidate to be a top 3 quarterback this year. But I do think that he could also underperform to start the season. That's not how you want your season to start. Add the New York Jets defense. Now, hopefully if your league plays defenses and you drafted a defense during your draft, you were looking at their week 1 matchup. Hopefully you got a team like Dallas, because Dallas has 3 awesome matchups to kick off the year. They get the Giants, then they get Washington, and then they get Miami. You can just plug Dallas into your lineup and not worry about a defense for almost a month. If you do need a defense, though, I don't mind the Jets. They have low ownership over on Yahoo. And FanDuel Sportsbook has this contest against the Bills with a 40.5 point over-under, so that's pretty low. And we know that Josh Allen should be better as a passer, but we also know that there's potential for turnovers and sacks. Because last year, teams facing Josh Allen averaged 2.3 sacks and an interception per game. Now, I don't think the Jets are the best defensive option out there, but they're lower owned, and I think that they're a decent streaming option. The 16th transaction that you can't get in the 15 transactions column, the one that's exclusively for this episode only, is to add Matthew Stafford. Now, similar to defenses, hopefully you're not looking for a quarterback streamer just yet. But if you don't like your quarterback's week 1 matchup, maybe you want a streamer. And I think that Matthew Stafford is at least somewhat intriguing. I don't love that he's on the road, but that game has a pretty strong over-under of 47 points over on FanDuel Sportsbook. And the Lions are road favorites. And the Cardinals' defense is also really bad, and their secondary specifically will be without Patrick Peterson, who's suspended, and Robert Alford, who's on IR. So Stafford's not the worst play in the world, but I do hope that you have a better option from your draft. That's it for today's show. Thanks to all of you guys for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, do me a favor and leave a rating and review. Thanks, everyone. I'll be back in your ears tomorrow.